The Centre presents a new podcast, CBmE and You, a podcast devoted to promoting awareness and debate around controversial ethical issues in biomedicine.
Hello and welcome to CBmE and You, a podcast by the Center for Biomedical Ethics. Today's topic, the ethics of having children. When is it permissible to have children? What ethical considerations should parents or potential parents consider before having a kid? Joining us today is Marcus Teo, PhD candidate here at the Center. Welcome, Marcus.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi. It's okay. It's safe to be here. This is a safe space. So we have some introductory questions to get to know you a bit better. Coffee or copy?
Kopi o kosong?
Copy or cos? I'm still learning the word every time
I think he's
say it.
flexing on you right now.
Yeah, I know. It's okay. He can. He's Singaporean.
Yes, it's just black coffee without sugar.
Nice. What country do you want to travel to next the most?
I've been thinking a lot about this. I think the next country I really want to travel to is Japan. I've actually never been.
There's a consistency in this podcast. I think everyone bar one or two people has said Japan.
Yeah. Japan, popular tourist destination among biomedical ethicists.
Wonderful niche to have.
Okay, my favourite question, the one I know you have been looking forward to the most and did not have a breakdown last night about. What's your go-to karaoke song?
Okay, so I have been anticipating this question because I am a regular listener myself. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Slid that in there.
It's a sassy one.
So I have a few answers to this. I've, in my memory, been to the karaoke once, and I think I enjoyed singing Coldplay's Viva La Vida. It's a great song to have at a karaoke.
Is that different from is it Robin Martin? No, that's an actor. How does it go?
I'm not going to sing that for you on this podcast. I don't think that's a good idea for myself nor the audience.
I think it would bring in so many more viewers, so many more listeners.
I feel like that's not my prerogative.
Yeah, that's fair. That's our job.
We should probably edit this out, but it's the one that goes.
Oh my god, I do know that one.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Up
Thank
to
you.
10 seconds is the YouTube rule, I believe.
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
So Viva La Vida by Coldplay would be was the song that I really enjoyed singing. The last time I went to a karaoke, the only time I've ever been to a karaoke. If I had the chops for it, I would love to do theatre. So anything from Les Mis. Les Mis is my favorite musical. Or my other choice would be some of the straight ahead jazz standards.
Okay. Yeah. I'm familiar. Straight ahead.
Can we get you to do the scatting thing one of these days? The skibidoo-boo-boo-doo-doo.
Maybe.
I feel like you wanted to do that more, James.
Yeah, no, maybe that's a me thing.
Yeah, I feel like you wanted to put that into the podcast. And
Absolutely.
Just look
We're
for an
not
excuse
cutting that
for
out.
Yeah. Fair play. That was good.
Skibidoo-ba-ba-ba-da-boo.
Okay, that's enough now. Yeah.
That's enough now.
What do you think? You think you run this podcast?
This podcast has gone awry so fast.
This is cursed already.
All right.
Okay, real questions. First one. Most people think that as long as you're pretty sure that you can provide for your kids and as long as you're pretty sure that you're going to love them, it's okay to have children. I know you have some thoughts about this, so I'd like to open by inviting you to share your thoughts and some of your concerns about what most people think, the common consensus or the common sense about having children.
Right. So in your question, you ask, most people are pretty sure about being able to provide for their children, that they will love their children. And that already insinuates that there is some room for error, right? I think one thing that I would be personally concerned about is whether or not those suspicions kind of like realize. And of course, in many cases they do. And people, especially for those who have been trying or they're young couples who decide that they want to expand their families, they go like, okay, we're gonna make a child and we will provide everything that we can for this child. That's great. The second part of your question that struck me was whether or not that is sufficient for procreation, and that's a lot of what I do my work in. And I think, as I'm sure we'll get more into as this podcast episode progresses, I think there's a lot that we need to consider if we are interested in being, good people, for lack of a better term, or moral people, that we need to think about when it comes to the plausibility of, or the remote possibility of bringing a life into this world, and the kind of responsibilities that we would have to undertake to make sure that we do so in the most responsible way we can. So just off the top of my head, right, if we say, well, I'm pretty sure that I will care for this child, I have adequate resources to ensure that this child will, live, an unremarkable life in the best ways possible, then, we also have to contend with possibilities that the world isn't just that neat. A lot of things that we do, a lot of things that we are at the mercy at are just not within our control, and there's nothing we can do about it. We are all one road traffic accident away from having any reasons for a life worth living to be stripped from us. Just to put a nice positive start to this podcast.
So what you're saying is loving someone and being able to provide for them is not sufficient enough reason to have them.
I think we have reasons to suspect. We have reasons to suspect against that, right? I think, it's certainly important, right? I would want anyone who wants to become a parent to have these things. I'm not saying that they're bad things to have. I'm just saying that we might be interested to think that there might be more that would be necessary for someone to procreate in a morally permissible manner.
Okay, so there are two, or generally at least two people in this consideration. There is, or generally maybe three. There are the people interested in having children, and then there is the child themselves. And I'm assuming that some of your reasons apply to separate persons. So looking at the parents asking this question, why, can you give us your best reason why they shouldn't, or the circumstances in which someone should not have a child?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different reasons that can mean something here, and they all lead to different kinds of arguments. So one argument that I think has gained a lot more traction recently is what we call eco-antinatalism, right? So these are young couples who are well educated, and they kind of present with very strong climate anxieties, and we also understand and we have evidence to believe that having a child is what will just immediately jack up your carbon emissions, right? From the amount of single-use things you have to kind of go through as you take care of your child, and just the sheer amount of things that you consume and have to do by bringing a child into this world. The eco-conscious among us might see that as a good reason to refrain from having children. So that's one of the reasons that I think came up quite relatively recently, and I think are quite strong. At the very least, it's something that if you don't subscribe to, or if you don't think that eco-antinatalism is strong enough to stop you from having a child, at the least it puts pressure upon you as a prospective parent to be mindful of your carbon footprint while you're there. So that's one reason, right, that we ought not to have, that we might have reasons to think we shouldn't procreate. But the reason that I'm more interested in and what I work on the most is, it goes by many names, but I think the most succinct way I would put it is called compassionate antinatalism, which is a kind of antinatalism that stems from concerns over a prospective child's suffering as they are brought into the world.
So it sounded to me just now when you were describing some of your concerns, you said that, well, even if you are pretty sure that you're going to love your child, even if you're pretty sure that you have the resources to care for a child, stuff can still go wrong. You might get into a car accident or something else might happen. There are so many possible things that can happen in the world that will really mess up your life, right? But of course, these risks exist for anybody, and no matter what you do, there's always going to be some risk. So could you just paint a picture for me, like under what conditions would you say that, yeah, maybe having a child is permissible. What do you have to do? Like, it seems like the bar could be anywhere from extremely high to something a bit more moderate.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a question that a lot of what I do aims to try and discover. Because so historically, some antinatalists, right now I'm thinking in particular Professor Mati Haira, he's famous for a piece that he wrote in year 2000, I believe, which now is dubbed the risk argument. So back then, Professor Haira ran the risk argument, and he argued that any potentiality for risk at all has to be avoided. Right, but obviously now we think that that's super counterintuitive because we undertake risks at everything that we do. Just drinking water entails some risk of choking to death. So what I'm interested in, as you rightly point out, is where is this benchmark? So what I propose generally is a much more moderate view, where I think that there is some way for a life to be worth starting or permissibly starting. And just that I think that bar is really high. So when we think about risks, there are quite a few kind of conceptual themes here that we need to pick apart. The first concept is the difference between a life worth starting and a life worth continuing. And those are two very important themes that I interact a lot with in my research that I think have very important normative upshots. Right. So, for example, for a life to be worth continuing, I think that it takes a lot less to justify continuing a life than it takes to start a life, right? Because that life has not started for the case of the latter. Whereas, when it comes to a life worth continuing, there is already an existent person with existent interests and desires and projects and all that good stuff. Now, when we think about starting a life, those good things that we think about in our own lives, we cannot prescribe to a valid target. So we cannot say that a prospective child has desires because they don't exist. But it's precisely because they don't exist that I think we can respond to risk in very different manners that we might consider appropriate. So one way to kind of like flesh this out without being too conceptual about it is to think, well, yeah, you take a risk every time you cross the street, but you are a living person with existing desires and projects and all this stuff that you pursue, and crossing the road or crossing the street is something that you need in a kind of needs-based kind of idea. You need to cross the street. You need to do these things and crossing the street is important to you for qua being a human. Now, you can't say the same for a child that hasn't come into existence. That child does not need to come into existence. And just by a needs-based account alone, we see that risk has very different upshots. We take risk that we need to take, but suddenly if you feel like, oh, I don't need to take this risk, for example, I don't need to cross the road unnecessarily to get to my destination, then yeah, you'll be taking a risk for no good reason. And that's how I see needs as one of the ways we can kind of appropriately identify the difference between a prospective child and a human person.
Okay, but so we've talked a lot about risks, but of course, coming to existence also comes with potential benefits. So why not just say that if, for every potential risk of a car accident, you can have an ice cream or something like that. Both are equally of the exact same amount of value.
I mean, technically, no one's stopping you.
Yeah. Both could happen at almost the same time. But, so why not just say that as long as the potential risks are outweighed by the potential benefits that you can bring into a child's life, those risks are just outweighed.
Yeah, that's a very common intuition. And that is something that I'm interested to kind of like think about as well. And I think through a lot of my research, I've come to form the opinion that harm, or in this case, risk of harm, counts more heavily towards our moral actions, or counts more heavily in action guidance than the conferment of benefit. And I think that's an asymmetry that I'm quite convinced about, but certainly not everyone is, right? I think there are some of our colleagues who might disagree with me quite strongly here. But so I think, right, like if that the prevention of harm is a more important kind of moral prerogative than the conferment of benefit. So one way I might flesh this out, again, to cite another philosopher, is Shona Shifrin in 1999, when she came up with what she calls the consent argument. So she demonstrated this asymmetry by kind of drawing up this thought experiment, right? She said, well, okay, in the first case, consider that you are trapped in your car and your car is sinking and you are going to drown and die. Now, I could save you, but in the process of saving you, I break your arm. I.e., in this case, I would have harmed you, but I harm you to prevent a greater harm, i.e., death, drowning to death, slow and painful death. Now, consider this against a second case where, you're asleep, and I just come into your bedroom and I just break your arm, and then you wake up and you're like, "What the hell, man?" And I'm like,
That would be my reaction. What the hell, man? Broke my arm.
Yeah, exactly.
Not why you in my room.
Suppose I show up in your room and I break your arm and you're like, "What the hell?" And then I tell you, "Oh, hold up. But, what I just did is I broke your arm, but I'm going to confer upon you 10 IQ points. You're going to wake up tomorrow morning 10 IQ points smarter, but you have a broken arm." Right. And what Shona Shifrin invites us to do now is to compare these two cases and say, well, in which one of these cases do I take a morally permissible action? And it seems quite intuitive that it's a lot easier for us to justify harming somebody to stop them from coming into a greater harm down the road than to harm somebody to confer upon them a benefit, right? And one upshot here is that, look, you could very well consent to having your arm broken for 10 IQ points. Shona Shifrin's point is that in both cases, people don't consent, right? Like in the drowning case, you can't consent because you're kind of underwater. It's a bit hard to speak. And then in the second case, you're asleep. And now she uses this thought experiment to think about procreation, right? She accepts, as do most of us, that procreation entails some level of harm. And she thinks that, well, the only time it's justifiable to harm somebody without their consent is only to prevent a greater harm. And I think that's quite intuitive to me. I wouldn't think that I would be justified to harm somebody if I think that I was going to confer upon them some benefit. Now, one way that I depart from a lot of other antinatalists that have come before me here is that I think that if the benefit was great enough, it could technically justify some level of harm, right? Like if I plucked a hair off your head without your consent, and I told you that, oh, but I'm going to sell this hair for like $1 billion and it's all yours. Suddenly I think, well, maybe we might be justified in doing that. Well, Shona Shifrin might disagree, but I think that it's at least a lot more defensible a potential action to take. So this then brings us all back to thinking about benchmarks, right? Like at what point can we say that a life is justified to start? And generally, after all this talking, my answer is just that benchmark is surprisingly high, simply because the avoidance of harm plays a bigger role than conferment of benefit, even if you think that coming into existence would be a net benefit.
I am concerned, though, with the use of the idea that, well, a person doesn't have interest until they exist, so therefore you can't count those benefits as something that the non-existent person has interest in. In the same way, though, you can't then count the harms to those interests as reasons to not bring them into existence, in the same way you can't use the benefits of their interests. So then how do you deal with that asymmetry if you're saying, I'm not going to consider your future benefits, but I will consider your future harm?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And here, one way that I've come to think about it is inspired by, again, now the most famous antinatalist philosopher is David Benatar. He wrote his book, Better to Never Have Been, in 2006. And in there, he argues that there is a very distinct difference in kind of this like ontology of pleasure and pain, and that led to his famous asymmetry of pleasure and pain. So Benatar argued, quite convincingly, I think, that harm is bad simpliciter. So harm is bad irrespective if there are people to experience that harm, whereas pleasure is good insofar as there are people to experience that pleasure. He tries to explain this in several ways. For example, he thinks that, a world is made better by removing harm in it, even if, for example, no harm was felt or that removal was not felt by anybody. But a world would only be made better if pleasures were felt by some people in that world. That's kind of one way to bring it up. I think that's kind of getting into very thick metaphysical concepts that I don't think I'm super equipped to answer as well. But I think we could take both harms and benefits for prospective people seriously, right? Let's just we can do that, at least for now, and then consider, okay, when we bring a child into this world, yes, we can consider that they will have future interests. They will also be subject to harm, and ask ourselves, how do we react, or how do we interact with these prospective harms and benefits? And this is where, again, I will cite Benatar, because I think he points out a very important intuition here, that we think of ourselves as having a far greater duty to prevent the birth of children into abject suffering than to bring happy people into the world. For example, if you choose not to give birth, and you cite that, well, I don't think I should procreate because I have less reasons to think that my child will live a good life, for example, you might actually be celebrated as a good person, right? But now if you choose not to procreate because we have no duty to bring happy people into this world, but we have a duty to prevent the birth of people into abject suffering, right? If you had refrained from procreation because you have reasons to think that your child would enter into abject suffering, you might be a good person, you might be celebrated for that reason. But if you brought a child into this world and you say, well, I think that this child would have a good life and all that, you're just like, okay, right? You could be celebrated, right? You would be a good parent, and if your child turns out well, all's great. But I think we respond, at least to my intuition, we respond better to the case of the prospective parent who opted not to bring a suffering life into this world than the parent who successfully brought a happy life into this world.
So I think that a lot of this discussion so far has been interesting, but I think it's been based on some premises that we haven't actually been explicit about, which is the difference between the words harm and suffering, and the different natures of harm and suffering. And so I think there are many people who value suffering, or even I would say most people value some form of harm. And I think that we can regret the harmful things that happen to us, but we know for certain that they either made us better off, or we learned something from them, or some people say you can't love without hurting, because they come hand in hand. You cannot have this benefit without a corresponding harm. And so in our last episode, palliative care physician Han Yi said that the suffering experienced during end of life can bring incomparable meaning to one's existence. So if it is therefore true that existence is suffering, or it contains suffering, could someone else not just claim, well, suffering is meaningful?
Yeah, the way I see it is that suffering in this sense is suffering that is outweighed by some greater benefit, right? So for the simplest way I like to explain this is to say, well, suppose that you want to do well for your exam, so you study really hard, and you are harmed, so to speak, because you have to mug, and you have to read, and you have to do all these things that you don't really want to do. But I'd
like to make it known to all my school teachers that I have been harmed.
Indeed, as have all of us. Yeah. So you undertake this harm, you consent to being harmed.
As a school kid, no.
Kids cannot consent, people.
That was below the age of consent.
Okay, maybe I'm thinking about university.
Thank you.
Because I certainly consented to being harmed in uni because I really want to do well in school. And so, but you see, in that case, the suffering that we're talking about is suffering that is outweighed by the benefit of doing well in school, getting good grades, getting into the PhD program that you want to be in, and being able to talk with your colleagues about smart things.
You should have been born just to be here with us today to talk.
Yeah.
No.
He's like, I'm being harmed right now.
But isn't saying that studying is harm a bit of a stretch?
Of course.
Can't some things be neutral, or just can some things be hard without being harm?
Sure. Right. Like that's just an example. You could think of like, oh, I'm gonna cross this really busy street. So I'm gonna take the overhead bridge. Climbing the stairs is a harm. You cannot deny that. There is no way I will accept counter arguments here.
Everyone, we've just discovered objective truths.
So I would harm myself by climbing up this flight of stairs, but it's outweighed by the benefit of crossing this really busy street without being run over by a car, or being able to meet whatever need or end goal I have across that street. So harm and suffering can be great if it's justified by some ends that outweigh the kind of like suffering or harm that we're talking about earlier on. So the exam example was my standard example that I give to people, but apparently some people now think that exams are not harmful, which I think, again, very, very counterintuitive.
Okay, maybe we pick a less controversial topic other than exams. But
Surgery.
Sure.
Yeah.
But even in the stair example, I think like harm can only exist to an interest. But life is just a juxtaposition of different benefits and harms to the same interests. Like the interest in my health comes at the harm to my laziness. And even picking up that lazy life of sitting on the couch eating all the snacks I ever wanted to exist is a life of harm. And so if we cannot have one without the other, are you saying we shouldn't have any?
Well, no.
No, that's not what I said.
Indeed. That is indeed not what I said.
I do laugh loud.
So, like, I think if it's tricky because obviously everyone suffers, right? Like at the very least, homeostasis, like just by virtue of being alive, we have to suffer. At the very least, at some point, you get hungry. You're hungry right now. I know this.
I did say this at the start of the pod.
Right.
I can confirm I am suffering dearly.
Just to be clear, we are not shaming each other for our dietary habits.
No, it is lunchtime as we're recording this.
That's why. They don't know.
They don't know.
The people don't know when we're recording.
Yeah. So we're recording this over lunchtime, and Sinead's getting really hungry, and I don't blame her for this. I'm not shaming her for this. But look, so we all suffer, right? Now, that doesn't tell us anything about lives of abject suffering. So, like, I think the reason why I was so quick to say no to what you just said is, well, yes, you're right. Like, there are harms that we undertake every day, and we think that a lot of these harms are very meaningful. But you don't get that kind of state of meaningfulness, that property of meaningfulness when it comes to harm is not transitive to a lot of other cases, right? If suppose now you are living in, the myriad of war-torn territories around the world, that harm you don't really get to kind of like think is like, oh, super meaningful, especially if, you're talking about, oh, I'm a civilian, I'm just waking up, going about my business, and there is every likelihood that there's a sniper in the building across from me. Suddenly you're like, well, maybe that harm could be avoided. Now, what's all of this is just to say that, yes, you're right to point out that harm in many cases is justified. But that doesn't stop us from trying to consider that, well, maybe we can reduce the amount of harm that is required of us, or like that we need to have in this world. If suppose I have a pill that would put you in, the absolute pink of health without having to work out, without having to diet, without having to go through surgery or enhancement, would that not be a better outcome than having to, squat and do leg day every week?
See, you got me there because I hate squats. But if you had said,
Pandering to
but
the
then you
audience.
wouldn't have to rock climb, or you wouldn't have to swim, or you wouldn't have to surf, I would say, well, I mean, it would be nice to be healthy, but I'm going to do these things anyway.
Sure, right? So then in that case, you are pursuing some kind of pleasure, right? Because you seek or like you
but it's
derive pleasure.
In your words, it's hard, and therefore it's harmful.
Sure. So suppose you really enjoy rock climbing, and I say, well, okay, you can still enjoy rock climbing, go rock climbing and everything, but you don't have to worry about the calluses on your hands peeling, right? You don't have to worry about the kind of trade-offs.
You saw straight through me. That is a good argument.
Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to say, right? Like, there are cases where harm is meaningful, but they are meaningful insofar as we know them right now. Again, surgery is good because, yes, you are harmed by being cut open, but you are benefited overall because you are, cured or treated for some illness. Now, if there was some future in which I didn't need to cut you open to solve that same problem, would you not think that's choice worthy? So it's compatible to say that some harms are very meaningful and at the same time claim that we could do with having less harm in the world.
Yeah.
All these examples seem to me to show, though, that there is some trade-off that we would happily take in most circumstances, where we voluntarily take on some harm in order to experience a benefit. We're talking about studying, we're talking about working out, eating healthy, climbing upstairs.
Sorry.
That
was a good example.
Yeah,
it was reflexive.
yeah. I would climb up a flight of stairs to like get some ice cream, right? Okay, we all have different utility profiles.
Yeah, I'm not an ice cream
I'm just
enjoyer.
saying, pick
yeah.
a better example.
Anyway, so the point is, this seems to suggest to me that there is an exchange rate that we would take on. And I think, let's say we can find an exchange rate that the majority of people would take on in any hypothetical situation. And perhaps that exchange rate might be pretty permissive in some cases, right? Like having to work out really sucks sometimes, but it's worth it for the health benefits. So I guess what I'm asking is, might you be underestimating the permissiveness of this kind of exchange rate? And therefore, it might be more permissible to have children as long as you can ensure that you kind of hit the right exchange rates.
Yeah, that's something that I'm interested to think about a lot as well, and that's something that I've written about in some cases. So we're back to square one, where we're thinking about, well, okay, insofar as I can ensure to the best of my ability that my child will have a good life, then it should be permissible for me to procreate, and that's the kind of standard common sense view. So all I argue is that there might be some case, and I think you might be right, perhaps, that I'm underestimating this exchange rate, to employ your terms. But I think that the bar for permissible procreation is still really, really high just to justify these harms. Now, recall that earlier I talked a lot about how harm kind of affects us very differently depending on our state of existence, right? We undertake harms to pursue meaningful things. Prospective children don't have that, right? They don't have these meaningful things, at least not yet. Now, what I've argued for is this thing called the likelihood asymmetry. Because apparently us antinatalists really enjoy asymmetries. But what I argue is that in coming into existence, being harmed is necessary. Now, I don't argue that all existence is suffering, right? Existence equals suffering. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that all existence contains suffering necessarily, right? Again, we can think about the lower level kind of suffering from like hunger, thirst, thermoregulation, all the way up to things like existential dread, climate anxieties, and all that. But on the converse, reasons to think that you have a life worth living are not guaranteed. Now, your parents certainly play a big role here, right? If they have the resources for it, they have a good environment for you to grow up in, but not being born into abject poverty or war, then yeah, there's a greater chance that you might have access to a life worth living. But you see, that kind of, like, it's not as guaranteed as knowing that a prospective child will suffer. Now, what this tells us is that we have to consider that when we decide to procreate, and we want to do so in a way that is morally permissible, we need to make sure that asymmetry is something that we can reasonably account for. And in another argument, I've put forth the concept that maybe it's a lot harder than we think, because reasons for a life worth living, it takes a lot to think that a life is worth living. And now to kind of ensure that is something that no person can possibly do, precisely because of the likelihood asymmetry that I've mentioned earlier on, but also because so many things are outside of our control, right? You could be the richest person in the world, and your child might still grow up to, again, experience the worst levels of existential dread. There's the great tale of Gautama Buddha kind of tells us that it's not the kind of stuff that you were born into. It's just you look around you, and there are just kind of causes or like sources of suffering that pervade our existence, no matter how well off you are. So I think that sets us up in a starting position, or an initial position that's already against the favor of the prospective child, and it's going to be an uphill battle to kind of like turn the tide to make sure that child has a life worth living in a way that, again, we cannot guarantee.
So does this mean if there is a very high threshold that there is an onus on prospective parents to prove why they should have children, rather than the current norm, which is that people who don't have kids have to prove why they're not having them?
Yes, definitely. I think we're starting to see that a lot more. In local news, we are looking at articles that are being published about how younger couples are opting to have less, if not no, children, and perhaps filling their homes with pets instead of children. And I recall once seeing an article or an opinion column, I can't remember what it was, calling for that exact thing. They're saying that, well, why are we interrogating our young couples for their decisions not to have children when, these are the people who want to be responsive to, the kind of the weight of that decision of bringing a life into this world. Instead, we ought to consider interrogating those to justify why they decide to have children. I would not be surprised. Of course, I have not done the empirical work here, so I cannot claim to know. But I will not be surprised if kind of our common sense is shifting towards needing to justify procreation instead of justifying refraining from procreation. So I think you're absolutely right. These pressures, irrespective of whether or not you're convinced by antinatalism, at the very least, we have to admit that the arguments put forth by antinatalism gives rise to concerns, and these kind of pressures that we can, I think reasonably place upon prospective parents to at least try and navigate as they continue on their endeavors to procreate.
So with that in mind, can we pretend that James is deciding whether or not to have children? What would your advice be? And please look him dead in the eyes as you answer this.
No. No. So
All right, that settles it.
So convincing.
Yeah. So the view that I defend is what I call moderate antinatalism, right? As we've talked about today, I don't think that it's universally impermissible to have a child. So that's where I depart from the kind of like traditional antinatalists who argue things like, oh, all existence equals suffering, and that's bad, so you shouldn't have it. Like, I'm not that edgy.
Such a Gen Z. You traditionalists. I'm not as edgy as you.
Yeah.
When we meet David Benatar, we'll let him know he's a bit of an edgelord.
I think he knows.
But so much Riz.
So, yeah. Defending a moderate... Why I call it moderate antinatalism is because I don't think that there is a universal kind of prohibition on having children, right? It's just that I think it's just a lot more difficult than we intuit to justify having children. That's all I'm saying. Now, so suppose that James now comes to me and is like, hey, I'm really considering making a child. My first honest question would be why? And I don't mean this in a way like I don't mean this in a very disrespectful manner, right? I'm not going like, why would you do that? No, one reason why I think why is a very important question to ask is because I think that we should be interested not to create children as a project, as means to our own ends. So if the moment you hear things like I'm gonna make a child because number one, it would save my marriage. Number two, I want to have progeny, right? I want to leave behind some symbol of my existence. I want to pass on my genes. Like a lot of these reasons that people can come up with as to why they want to have children in a very shallow sense tends, if you think about it, it makes children a means to an end. And I really don't think that's something that we ought to do, right? If we don't think that it's permissible to make use of someone else as a means to our own ends, especially if that comes to harm them, I don't see why we can permissibly do that to our children. So in my own culture, it's very common to say like, oh, if you don't have children, nobody will take care of you when you're old. Now, I think that that's really problematic. Why would I want to, make someone come into existence, experience the harm that they will experience, and yeah, sure, experience the benefits that they will experience, right? But I'm doing this because I want to have a caretaker when I'm old. I just
that you don't want to pay for.
Yeah, you don't want to pay for.
That's literally it.
Sure, right? And so yeah, that's one thing I would really want to ask, like why? And I think that in terms of kind of the motivations that come up for creating children, the only plausible motivation that I think would be plausibly justifiable here is to say that I want to create a child because of like I want to like make this child have like the best life, and like everything is for the child as an ends in themselves. Now, there are some ways to argue against this, right? So I could potentially say, well, yeah, but because this child is not an ends in themselves yet, what you are doing is you are, again, desire satisfaction, right? Like you want to create this child, you want to do things right by this child. That's your desire. That child does not have a desire to be done right by, to be respected, to have dignity. And yeah, so my question would then be motivation, right? I think that there's like a scalar kind of ways in which we can think about our motivations to have children, and some are better motivations than others. If you are having children for the sole purpose of social security, please just buy an insurance plan. See your agent. But if you're having children because you're saying like, oh, I think that there are really meaningful things that can arise from my child's life, and I strongly believe that I can make that happen, and this child will want for nothing, this child will be the happiest person in the world, maybe that's more justifiable than having children for social security. Yeah.
What if the justification, what if the story was something more bigger, something like, oh, my government says that I should have 2 or more children if I can afford it. That's my motivation.
You don't have to answer that question.
Yeah, it's interesting because now you see that motivation is again very extrinsic, right? Like now that motivation can come together with an intrinsic motivation of all the noblest sources, right? So it could be the case that my government, this government wants me to have more than 2 children, for example. And I intrinsically really want children. I have every reason to think that this child's going to have a good life. I will provide for this child, and everything that happens, I will take full responsibility. Like all the, the cards are stacked towards your favor. Sure, right? It's not mutually exclusive. You don't get to say like, oh, because some political power told me to have 3 children, I'm going to have 3 children. Like that's not how the world works. At least not how I hope it does. Certainly not what I can see. And I really, if it's not the way it is, I really don't want to know.
Yeah. I wonder if your arguments apply the strongest to a couple who are deciding to have a child, and then instead of creating one, they just adopt. Because then you have all of the wonderful reasons, but not the responsibility of actually creating them. But in order for that to be true, someone else has to create them.
Yeah, so that is actually the exact upshot from my PhD thesis. And you foresaw that, which I think I would imagine is not super far from imagination, but that is the exact upshot that I'm trying to argue for. So there's so much to discuss here, right? If we talk about choosing to procreate versus adoption, in my PhD work, I argue that we have a very strong moral obligation to firstly consider adoption and only procreate if adoption for some reason just cannot work for you. And that can happen for several reasons, but those reasons that I do not accept are things like preference.
Yeah.
Right. So what I argue for is what I call a conditional obligation. A conditional obligation to adopt instead of procreate. It's a pretty long name. But I call it a conditional obligation because I use that obligation to target only those individuals who intend to make a transition, right? So a psychosocial transition into becoming parents. So I'm not interested, even though I might be in the future, I'm not interested at this point to say, well, globally, all of us should be adopting children irrespective of whether or not we want to be parents, right? That would be interesting for future work, but not right now. So now I'm targeting people who want to transition into becoming parents. I think that they should first and foremost adopt. And if they choose to procreate, they have to justify procreation against their decision not to adopt, right? And this is where, again, it comes back to kind of one of your earlier questions about justifying non-procreation versus justifying procreation, kind of that culture shift. And I think that there are a lot of good reasons to think that such a conditional obligation might be true. For example, you're right, someone would have had to create that child first. But at the point of time of deciding of whether or not you're going to have a child, or you want to expand your family unit, so to speak, your prospective child would not have existed yet, but there is an orphan child in need of a home, right? Like, sure, someone would have had to create that child first and then put that child up for adoption, which obviously is not ideal, but that's besides the point. The point is, I'm thinking of having a child. Now I'm thinking, okay, do I make one or do I adopt one? And there is a modal difference in the kind of suffering you're trying to deal with, right? A prospective child will suffer as a matter of necessity from coming into this world, but there is an existent child who is presumably, I think uncontentiously, harmed by being in an institution as an orphanage. And now I think it's quite intuitive to think that we have greater reasons to kind of like save or at least alleviate an existent person's harm than we have reasons to, confer a benefit upon a prospective future person, right? And this also takes into consideration the kind of like asymmetry that I was talking about earlier. So we look at, if we compare the kinds of harms from an orphan child and your prospective child, it seems like we really ought to prevent the harm or continued sustained harm or even exacerbated harm to an existing person, versus a harm that hasn't yet kind of like come into reality.
Have greater reason to save the drowning person than to create someone who will have an okay life.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's all we have time for today. This has been a fascinating discussion. James, no further questions? James has no further questions.
You said that we had no more time, so I'm done.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on. We have really enjoyed this chat with you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our new podcast. Subscribe online and tune in every first of the month. In the meantime, listen to CBmE and you, and be savvy.